Built at the heart of pharaonic power during the New Kingdom, one of the grandest temples ever constructed by the ancient Egyptians. A part of the Deir el-Bahari, a complex of tombs and mortuary temples situated near the Valley of the Kings. Across the Nile from the great city of Thebes and the massive temple complex of Karnak. In the shadow of El Kern, a mountain peak that forms almost a perfect pyramid. Carved into the cliff face itself, a massive multi-terrace structure that the ancient Egyptians called Djeser Djeseru, the Holy of Holies. What we call the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. Hey folks, this is James, aka Thresciornis, and let me start out by apologizing for the lack of videos lately. Festival season just kind of really kicked my ass this year, but that's over with, at least for me. I won't be doing any more festivals this year, so I'm going to concentrate on getting out more videos for you guys, and I promise it's going to be more regular. You may remember from our previous video on the Temple of Horus at Edfu that ancient Egyptian temples came essentially in two different types. The first type being the temples where the gods were worshipped, the god homes. This is a place where a statue would be kept, a statue that is considered the god, and the god would be taken care of and given offerings, and it was an administrative center. You can go watch that video to learn more about that. But today's video is about a mortuary temple, and these temples were built for the pharaohs, and they were separate from their tombs, sometimes built right next to their tombs, but they were a place for the pharaoh to be worshipped, given their honor as the child of a god and, of course, a person of wealth and power. And in many ways, you can see this as a continuation of ancestor veneration, a tradition that comes out of sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, the ancient Egyptians, they all venerated their ancestors. There was a place for ancestors in every home, but if the pharaoh is the pharaoh, and they're going to build these magnificent temples to ensure that their cult continues on after their death, and some of them did for hundreds of years. Also, it's fairly unique as Egyptian temples go. It's an extremely impressive structure from an impressive pharaoh with many great accomplishments. She added structures to the temples of Karnak and Luxor. She organized a trade expedition to the almost mythical land of Punt. She invaded Nubia, and of course, even more impressive because she was a woman. And even though her descendants would try to erase her from history, still her accomplishments remain. I know this isn't a history channel, and I promise that we are going to get to the subject of magic and how it relates to this temple and other temples like it. But I think we would truly be remiss if we didn't at least go into a little bit the history of this temple's builder. Hatshepsut was born around 1500 BCE to the 18th dynasty. And during this time in Egypt, the royals were obsessed with keeping the bloodlines pure. So you'll find a lot of marrying between siblings. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and his sister Ahmose. Hatshepsut herself would end up marrying her half-brother, Thutmose II, but he would die when his offspring, Thutmose III, was just 2 years old, leaving Hatshepsut to be the queen regent, the royal wife, because the Egyptians didn't really have a name for queen. But this was pretty common, that the mother of the incoming pharaoh, if he was too young to serve as a ruler, would end up ruling in his place until he came of age. But Hatshepsut took it a little bit further. It's impossible to ascribe motive to people from so long ago, but what is certain is that Hatshepsut was a woman of intelligence and of will, and she had the skills for leadership. During the 7th year of her son's reign, she declared herself co-pharaoh. And after that, she started having statues made depicting her as a man with a beard, wearing the clothes of a man. She also had statues made of her as Osiris, as many of the pharaohs before her did as well. She even started using the male version of her name, Hatshepsut. As was also the tradition, Hatshepsut claimed herself to be the daughter of a god, and in this case, the daughter of the god Amun, and that was for political reasons as well, as Amun was the chief god of Thebes, which was the capital at the time. In her own words, she called her mortuary temple a garden for my father Amun, and in its day it would have had pools of water and groves of trees, not the barren, desolate place that it is today. There are some references to her subjects calling her Good Queen Hatshepsut, and one of her major accomplishments, as I mentioned before, was that she led a trade expedition to the land of Punt, which was the only place that Egyptians could get certain luxury items, one of those items being myrrh, which was almost required in the temples, and none of which grew in Egypt itself. Hatshepsut, being an intelligent woman that she was, had 12 of these myrrh trees brought from Punt, and they were planted around her mortuary temple. For a reason unknown to us, her son Thutmose III decided to try to erase her name from history some 20 years after she died. Some people think that it's because she was seen as upending the order of things, that a female pharaoh was somehow an offense against Ma'at. And of course, that bastard Akhenaten included her and the gods of her temple for erasure as well. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Akhenaten. But her accomplishments were just too large and too numerous. No matter how many of her male descendants tried to erase her, she would be known to us because she just left too much behind. So in Hatshepsut's temple, a person would literally be elevated as they got closer and closer to the inner sanctum. And another unusual thing about her mortuary temple is that it's built on 2 axes. The main chapel, the main focus of her temple is the Chapel of Amun, where the great statue of Amun is kept. It is a temple to Amun, her father. So For the east-west axes, and remember, the east is the land of the living and the west is the land of the dead, there would be a processional that comes out of Thebes, a whole way lined with sphinxes, that goes across the Nile and into the desert and up into the temple and ends at this chapel to Amun. But this temple also had a north-south access, and in the north there is a solar court, temple to Horus, Hor-Karati, that a petitioner would start at and move towards the south through a chapel to Thutmose I, her father, and eventually ending up at Hatshepsut's own mortuary temple, the chapel where she received offerings. Let's stop here for a minute and talk about how the concept of thresholds or gates are a vital part of Egyptian spirituality. And not only do you have this manifested in their temples, it is also their view of the Dawat, the underworld, that it is a series of thresholds or gates that one must pass through. Even the gods themselves have to pass through various thresholds as the bark of Ra makes its way through the underworld. You'll see this in the Book of the Dead. You'll see this in other associated funerary literature, the Book of Gates, which is called the Book of Gates. And I look at this and I can see it sort of as a complex form of shamanic journeying. This is a path that a soul takes to reach some kind of deific, purified, enlightened form. And I think that it's not only for the dead, but it could also be a guide for a living magus. And then, of course, there's nothing stopping you as a magician from recreating this sort of crossing over. Now, of course, most of us can't afford to have separate rooms for our temple or multiple doorways leading up to it, but we can demark lines, places as we approach our altar. We can have certain rituals that we have as we approach our altars, approach our statues of the god. We could have purifications even, and those purifications don't need to be, cleaning up. They can be purification through incense, they can be purification through oils, they can be purification through confession, or even, let's say, negative confessions like we find in the Book of the Dead. So once again, I encourage you to come up with your own Book of the Temple and come up with your own rituals. And they could be short, they could be really simple, but have them for yourself as your process, the protocol of your temple. Speaking of rituals, festivals are a ritual on a grand scale. And this mortuary temple was famous as being the focus of one of the Egyptians' favorite festivals called the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, in which the statues of the gods, Amun, chief of them, would, like I said, be taken from the temples of Karnak and paraded through the Valley of the Kings and visiting the tombs that are there. And the Egyptians themselves, the people, would have picnics amongst the tombs. They would also set up stelae, little placard-like tombstones, which would have depictions of their own ancestors, where they would leave offerings, burn incense. The gods were given offerings of huge amounts of flowers, and then these flowers that have been touched by the gods would then be given as offerings to the ancestors And it was a beautiful celebration. And I can't help but think how similar it is to other festivals that were also held at harvest time. This was held during harvest, that honor the spirits of the dead, like Samhain, like Halloween, like Dias de los Muertos. This seems to be a theme in almost every culture, that we celebrate our ancestors during the harvest, and the Egyptians were no exception. And then the parade at the end of the festival would end at the Mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Jeseru, where the statue of Amun would spend the night in the chapel there before being returned to Karnak. Now, like I said, the choice of Amun as her godparent was a political one. As I've talked about before, and you can go read an article I wrote that explains this on my Tumblr blog, there'll be a link down below, that each Egyptian city had its own favorite patron god, and Amun was the god of Thebes, and he started out as, part of the Ogdoad, this primordial elemental being, and then eventually his cult grew. The city of Thebes grew in importance. He became the chief god, and then eventually by the New Kingdom, he was combined with Ra and became Amun-Ra. And keeping the favor of the people of Thebes, because one, it's your residence, and two, because it is the seat of power, was vitally important. Aside from what was politically expedient, the pharaohs would show their personal preferences as well. And here this manifests as chapels of Anubis and Hathor at Hatshepsut's temple. And I would like to think that she found Hathor particularly appealing because Hathor was powerful. Hathor was also a royal wife and also a ruler of a type. And I think that would be very, very appealing to a female pharaoh. And at the temple, you'll see a carving of Hatshepsut suckling at Hathor's udders, and then you'll also see these magnificent Hathor columns that are a part of that chapel. And it's one of the few examples where an Egyptian depiction that is essentially a relief and not a statue is not shown from a side perspective, but showing from a front-facing perspective. Okay, so let's get back to the magic part. And I know some of you are going to find this morbid, but all of this examination of these mortuary temples and these funerary cults gets one thinking of, am I prepared for my own passing? Am I prepared to go beyond the veil? As for myself, I don't believe that all of my ancestors were deluded. I do believe that we continue in some way after we pass. I couldn't say exactly what that is, but I do think it's important for a magus to prepare for it. It has been said that the best way to become rich is to be born rich. I think there's some truth in that. But what if one could be born rich into the afterlife? What if one could have a leg up as you enter the next phase of your existence, possibly a much longer phase of your existence? And I really think this is what the ancient Egyptians were getting at, that they wanted to be prepared, they want to enter the afterlife spiritually powerful and wealthy. Of course, most of us won't be able to copy the ancient Egyptians. We don't have that kind of means. Most of us will not have the means to be mummified. I know I myself am planning to be cremated, which would horrify the ancient Egyptians. But in this modern age, it is one of the few ways that one is able to keep control of their own remains. And I have prepared special vessels for my remains, and each vessel will carry an electronic copy of the Book of the Dead and the Book of Gates and parts of my own grimoires as well. It's also going to provide a focus for my magical descendants, the people who are part of my magical tribe, to talk to me, possibly leave me offerings. That would be nice, or at least to speak my name. And if I'm being honest with myself, well, part of why I make these videos is because I want to be remembered after I'm gone. And I really do think it's important to create a magical will. You should definitely have something that states your desires for what is going to happen to your magical tools when you pass. And it's actually, I think, a comfort to the people that you left behind, that they know what to do and that they can honor your wishes. Well, I hope I'm not ending on too much of a bummer for you there. I'm asking you, please, of course, to like and subscribe. And I'm going to try to crank out as many videos as I can until, well, Samhain comes up upon us. And then, of course, in November, we'll be in Egypt. And I won't be making videos then, but I'll have a ton of footage that I'm going to take while I'm there. And those, I'm sure, will carry us into the new year. Hey, as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Add your name to the Scroll of Thoth by joining our Ko-Fi fundraising campaign. Ko-Fi subscribers will receive access to the extensive archive of Scroll of Thoth podcasts, access to our private Discord server, special extended cuts of our videos, a 10% discount in our store on all Scarlet Ibis Apothecary items, bonus videos and other content, and a free 3-card tarot reading every month for those who subscribe for $10 or more. Help me create more videos on the occult and spiritual history of ancient Egypt. Discover a magic that goes beyond the repeated platitudes of Victorian-era dilettantes, and look into the true heart of the Western esoteric tradition.